If you're watching this video, you probably already have a finished quilt top and you're wondering where to go from here. If, however, you don't have a finished quilt top and you'd like to get started quilting but you have no idea where to start, I recommend going back to the beginning of this free Quilting for Beginners playlist, and I'll leave a link to the playlist in the description of this video. Now, this is the second shopping list in this course and it's nowhere near as expensive or extensive as the first list, but there will be a lot of choices to make. The steps for finishing a quilt are pretty universal. You mark, baste, quilt, and bind, but there are a lot of different methods to complete each step. So there's going to be a lot coming down to your own personal preference and how you want to accomplish each step. For that reason, I'm going to recommend several different marking and basting tools, but you absolutely do not need to get them all. Just pick your favorite. Before I start talking about the tools that you need to finish your quilt tops, I want to just go over real quickly the quilt construction process. So every quilt will have a quilt top, batting, and backing. Technically, there is a kind of quilt that doesn't have batting, and it's called a flimsy quilt. It just has these two layers quilted together, and that's for like really warm climates and stuff. But for the purposes of this video, we have 3 layers. So you would start with your backing right side or pretty side down. Then you would have your batting. And then on top of that, you would have your quilt top. And notice there is extra backing and batting around each edge of the quilt, and that's on purpose. You don't want them to be perfectly flush because things move when you quilt. So when you put these 3 layers together, it is called a quilt sandwich. Not my favorite term. I wish it wasn't called a quilt sandwich, but it is. So what are you going to do? So when you put your quilt sandwich together, you want to keep everything in place so the layers shift as little as possible. You want to keep them as straight and aligned as you possibly can. And to do that, you do something called basting. It can be done with several different types of tools, and I'll go into that more later on in this video. Before you baste all of your layers together, sometimes after, if you've forgotten, you might want to mark a quilting pattern on your quilt top. These can be simple or elaborate lines and patterns. And again, there are several different ways that you can mark your quilt tops, each with their own pros and cons. This is one of them, and it has a lot of cons, actually. You can do straight lines, you can do really curvy lines, you can do slightly, just sort of wavy lines. Really, there's no limit to this beyond what your machine is capable of and what you can imagine. And you may choose to skip marking your quilt completely and instead just take a more organic, free-form approach to it. You might follow the lines of your quilt, or you might just let your machine wander. I don't know. It's up to you. You might also choose to do very minimal quilting, have really wide spaces between each line, or you can do really densely packed stitches. But keep in mind, that would take a lot of extra thread and time. Whatever design you choose, once you're done quilting, you'll cut off all of the excess batting and backing that you'll be left with on the edges of the perimeter of your quilt. So it'll look something like this, with all of your edges being unfinished and raw, where you can still see the batting in between. There are a few different ways to finish these raw edges, but in this course I'm going to be focusing on binding. And this isn't bias binding either. It's very simple, and I'll show you how to make it and apply it. So that's the long and the short of it. Now let's get back to the shopping list. Let's start with the backing fabric because I think it's the most fun, because there are tons of possibilities that you can explore. You can match your backing to your quilt top. You could find something that's really cute and whimsical that speaks to you. You can choose something that's like really shocking, a lot of contrast, or you can just flat out get something that clashes. It doesn't matter. You can explore whatever you're interested in. You might also be interested in using a different type of fabric on the back, like flannel or cuddle fleece. If you do use a different fabric, just keep in mind that it might not behave in the same way as a quilter's cotton. For instance, minky is a little bit slippery and a little bit stretchy. So just keep in mind, it's not quite as straightforward if you pick something besides quilter's cotton. For my own quilt, remember I have reds and whites and pinks and creams. I chose to go with contrast, a lot of contrast, but it also has those pinks and reds and crimsons and creams in it. So it sort of matches, but mostly it's a lot of contrast, and I really like that for a quilt. It's sort of similar to those shoes that have those bright red soles. It's just a nice, interesting shock of color. Okay, now remember the tiny little example I showed you earlier, how there is a bunch of extra fabric and batting around the edges. So the exact amount of extra around your quilt can vary based on preference and how you're choosing to quilt, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to say play it safe. Make sure that your backing and your batting is 4 inches wider on each side and on the top and bottom. So 8 inches total on the side and 8 inches total on the length. And you might be wondering why you need so much fabric and batting around the edges. And the answer is pretty simple. Your fabric isn't static like paper, it has a stretch to it. And as you quilt, it might stretch a little bit here and there, and you want to make sure that your quilt top doesn't stretch over your batting or your backing. I didn't know that when I first started out, and I made a huge mistake. And I had this huge weird piece of quilt that was hanging over, and I had to do a sort of patch job, and it looked terrible. The extra fabric and batting also help as you're making your quilt sandwich, because you don't have to be as precise as you're laying it out. You don't have to worry that you're fine down here, but as you get up here, it's way askew and hanging off the edge. You'll also have to choose between a wide back fabric or a pieced backing. So imagine this is fabric straight off the bolt. Here are your selvage edges, and this is the length that you choose to have cut. And this, on the other hand, is the wide back fabric. So these are the finished edges, your selvages, and this is the width that you have cut, okay? So this is 108 inches wide, and this is somewhere between 40 and 44 inches wide, okay? If you get the wide back, it is so easy to lay out your batting and your quilt top, and you don't have to do any extra steps. You can start right away right there. If, however, you choose to do a regular width fabric, you're going to have to get really long cut, and then you'll cut it in the middle, like so. Then you'll arrange it like this. So these are your cut edges, selvage, selvage, and you'll trim these selvages too, because you don't want your selvages to show. So here's a lot of extra work. So cut in half, trim these selvages, and then you'll sew those edges together, like so. And then your quilt top will fit either like this or like this. And that will change depending on your quilt top too. Okay? So I definitely recommend a wide back because it's easier, although it can be harder to find the fabric that you like. I will leave a link to my favorite wide back provider. They have tons of options, but you can also check your local quilt store. There is a small section at Joann's, at least at my local Joann's. Maybe there's more at yours. But definitely shop around, and I think you can find something nice. But obviously there are more options if you do the regular width fabric. So just another weird choice you have to make. If you want to skip the fabric store altogether, skip all of that, you can just use an old flat sheet that you might have laying around in your linen closet. It'll work just as well, and you don't have to agonize over fabric choice. Okay, I should actually tell you how much you need if you do go to the fabric store though. For a wide back, you'll want 108, and then you'll want to have cut 1.5 yards to 1 3/4 yards, something on there. For a regular width piece of fabric, you're going to want to cut about 4 yards. And if for any reason you don't trust the way that they cut at your fabric store, maybe they're crooked or they have weird edges or something like that, you might want to get a little extra just to account for the wonkiness. Because some people do not cut straight and it's very annoying. The backing I chose is the extra wide stuff, so I'm not going to be doing a seamed or pieced backing in this series. There are several different ways to finish the raw edges of your quilt, but for this series, I'm going to focus on showing you a few different variations on a single fold binding. I recommend you get a 1/2 yard of the fabric of your choice. If you don't make any cutting mistakes, you are going to have leftover for another project, so make sure you pick a fabric that you like. When you're choosing your binding fabric, you have to think about the front of your quilt and the back of your quilt because it's a bridge between the two. Are you going to look for a fabric that complements both the backing and the quilt top, or are you going to prioritize the quilt top? You can do something that contrasts, or you can do something that blends in or matches. It's all personal preference. I'm going to keep saying that a lot because there are no hard and fast rules. So for my binding, I chose a fabric that already existed in my quilt. In fact, it's this one right here. So it made that super easy. I just picked one of those fabrics and I prioritized the top. Although I don't think it looks bad with the back, it just looks really Christmassy. So those are the fabric choices I made for my quilt. Try not to overthink yours, just have a lot of fun. And now we can move on to batting. Okay, your batting should be the same size as your backing, and that means 4 inches bigger than your quilt top on all 4 sides. So that part is pretty simple. However, there are a mind-blowing amount of options for batting. It appears simple. It makes your quilt fluffy. End of story, right? Unfortunately, no. There are a lot of different materials that batting can be made out of, and each one can change how the batting behaves in your quilt. I am by no means an expert on batting, so if you're interested in all the different battings and what they do and how they behave, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. There is a quilting YouTuber by the name of Stephanie Sebbing, and she did a great video all about batting, and I recommend you take a look. And I'll leave a link to that video in the description of this video. If, however, you couldn't care less about batting, I recommend you just get a simple cotton polyester blend. It's often called an 80-20, and I think it'll be great for your first quilt. And I'll leave a couple different suggestions in the description also. When you're buying batting in person, you can either buy a pre-cut batting in a bag, or you can buy a specific amount from a bolt, just like you would with fabric. So I personally prefer buying from the bolt because it has less wrinkles. I think it's just a little neater to work with, but bags are super convenient and I think they're easier to store too. So go ahead and choose based on what's more important to you. Just pay attention to the quilting recommendations for your batting because it's going to be important when you decide your quilting pattern. So for this batting, it says quilt up to 10 inches apart, and this one says 4 inches. That means your quilting lines should not exceed that limit. That's the farthest apart your quilting lines should be. Why? Good question. If you quilt farther than that, it will affect the longevity of your quilt. So basically, if your quilting lines are too far apart, when it comes time for you to wash your quilt, the batting will break apart and clump up inside your quilt. So your quilting lines are actually what is keeping your batting stable inside of your quilt. If your batting doesn't have any suggestions about how far apart you should quilt, I recommend you play it safe and not exceed 4 inches apart. There are a ton of different marking tools that you can use to mark your quilt tops. Each tool sort of has its own strength and weakness. There isn't just one single perfect tool. You might need a couple different ones. There's also the option of not marking at all and just doing organic lines and shapes and things. But for now, let's go over the tools. I'll try to go as quickly as I can. This is the Soline fabric pencil, and it's probably my most used marking tool. It's reliable, it doesn't stain, and it's easy to erase your mistakes if you make a mistake while you're marking your quilt. And it comes in a bunch of different colors, so you can decide on what color you use based on the fabric that you're marking. So if you're marking a really light fabric, you might do a darker lead, and if you're doing a darker fabric, you might use a lighter lead. I use pink mostly because it shows up pretty well on most colors that I am marking. I usually have to go over it a couple times back and forth like this. It doesn't seem to mark all at once very well, but that does make the pencil line a little bit thicker when I do that. So overall, it is a very reliable tool. However, if you mark your quilt and you handle it a lot, there is a chance that your lines might become blurry or disappear altogether, and then you'll have to remark your quilt. But usually you mark and then you quilt and there's not much of a gap in between, usually. So that's not much of a problem. And I like how easy it is to change the lead color. The next tool are water-soluble marking tools, and that just means they are washable. They wash out with water, or maybe they disappear as soon as water touches them with the pins. That's true. Usually. Some people think they work really well, but others will say that the lines don't wash out completely, so it might react differently based on the fabric it's used on, or it might be user error. It might even have something to do with the age of the pin, and performance probably varies from brand to brand. So this is a Joann's brand, and it worked okay. It was aggressively okay, nothing special. I've recently been looking at Soline's water erase pin and Soline's Aqua Touch marker. I'm going to leave links down below. I haven't used them, but I really want to. I think they're on my list of things to get. This is a pin. These are pencils. This is actually dried out because I broke the cap who knows how long ago. But the pencils seem to work just fine. It's very similar, I think, to the sew line, except the lead is much harder. To get a visible line, I have to really put pressure on this pen or pencil. So you can sort of see it. It's not quite, it's easy to see here, but it's harder to see in the darker colors a little bit. By the way, there's these bristly caps. I have no idea if they're supposed to erase your lead or not. It doesn't seem to make a difference. Here's the white, which shows up good here and not here, of course. So it's a good pair to have together, but it's not my favorite overall. And frankly, it's a lot easier to remove the sew line mark with a damp cloth than it is these two. But I'm sure it would come out in the washing machine. So there's a couple options for you. Next up is my friction pen, and this is a heat erasable pen. You just run your iron over it or you throw it in the dryer and the marks disappear. But that doesn't mean they won't reappear later on, and they are far from perfect. I used these pens for a long time without any problems until earlier this year. So like I said, it is supposed to erase with heat, but this particular time it mostly erased, but it left sort of a ghostly outline that just would not go away. I could not get it to go away. It didn't wash out either. It might not have been a problem if I was stitching directly over those lines, but the problem was I had decided to do something different, and so I wanted to go back to square one, and so yeah, it was a mess. So now I mostly just use these to make marks that I know won't end up showing up on a final project. I like this specific one because it makes really nice thin lines. These are Crayola washable markers, and I've mostly used them successfully with a couple exceptions. They make a nice, clear, easy to see line, and there are a lot of colors to choose from, which is nice. However, one time I was working on a project that got wet, and I thought it was no big deal. It'll wash. Eventually, it's just going to all wash out. It doesn't matter. The problem is that once the ink dried, that spot never washed out. Every part that hadn't gotten wet did wash out, but the previously wet part, it sort of blurred a little bit, and it just is still there to this day. So these markers might be an option if you are very careful to not get the ink wet until you're ready to wash it completely out. And also, the other con for these is that if you make a mistake while you're marking your quilt, it's very hard to undo. So when I use them, if I make a wrong mark, I just have to sort of scribble it or make a note to not use that line. I don't have to push hard at all to use it, which is nice. But it has a much thicker line, and it fuzzes just a little bit. But I do like that I can choose the colors. I can choose different colors for different projects. So there was orange. Here's yellow. I would use this one mostly on light fabrics, probably. Full disclosure, I don't completely trust this method. I've used it fine, sure, mostly, but I do have a quilt that I marked almost exclusively with this marker, and I never finished quilting it because I was afraid that I had left it for too long, and now I'm like, do I even want to finish this quilt if it's never going to be clean and presentable? I don't know. So just full disclosure there. Choose your methods carefully. I've heard online before someone recommending watercolor pencils, but I haven't personally used them. They say they wash out really great, but that'll be a trial and error sort of thing. If you have them on hand, maybe you can make a swatch or something and see if it washes out. There's also something called a pounce pad, and it basically looks like an old school chalkboard eraser, just it's filled with chalk. And they're made to be used with stencils, so you take your pounce pad and you rub it over your stencil, and then when you pick your stencil up, the pattern is on your fabric and you're ready to go, and it's super fast. It is, however, a little bit messy, and I think it might be similar to the fabric pencil, that it might get blurry and wipe off if it's handled a lot. Stencils are also really great. Some are specifically made for pounce pads, but most of them are easy to use with all sorts of different marking methods, whatever you're comfortable with. And they're really great. They save time if you're completely blocked and you have no idea what you want to do with your quilt top. But keep in mind, some stencils are good for just hand quilting, some are just good for free motion quilting, and then others are good for everything. For instance, this is good for anything. Nice straight lines, you don't have to measure anything. This one, however, you can see all the curves and the stopping points and then switching. This is for free motion or hand quilting. These curves would probably be a nightmare to do just on a regular machine without your free motion foot, because every time you make a turn, you have to turn your whole quilt. Whereas if you're free motion quilting, your fabric will go like this. So keep that in mind. This one is really great too. It's curves, but you can use this with your sewing machine. What you do is, instead of doing circles, you're going to be following the line down in these loose waves. So you can do that pretty easily on your machine without free motion quilting. So it looks hard, but it's actually simple-ish. The hardest thing is making sure that your fabric doesn't move too much, and that can be solved with maybe a little tape on your stencil to hold it in place. So that's definitely an option. Last but not least is a Hera marker, and a lot of people swear by this. It is a non-traditional marking tool. It makes a crease in your fabric instead of a mark on your fabric. I don't personally have one, but I have used a butter knife as a dupe before. So you see this round tip, it's not serrated, it's not sharp. I would use this tip to make a crease wherever I want to make a quilting line. Don't use the serrated part because you'll damage your fabric. But I rub it back and forth in the desired area, and it's much more difficult to see, but do you see that crease? That's the line I would follow for my quilting. I think this is a great method. I just have weak wrists, and over time, if I do a lot of this, it really, really makes my wrist sore. But if you have nice sturdy wrists, this is definitely a good option. A lot of modern quilters use this method, I think, because they don't have to wash their quilts then. They can keep them nice and dry and flat and hang them up and do whatever they're going to do with them. I'll be showing you 3 different ways to baste your quilt in this Quilting for Beginners series, and the first one is pin basting. These are simple bent quilting safety pins. They look like this. They're pretty simple and easy to use, but they do come with the chance that you might poke yourself every once in a while. Just don't bleed on your quilt, trust me. There is also a special tool that you can pick up to save your fingers, and I'll link that in the description. I don't have one. I wish I did. As far as how many safety pins you need for your quilt, the answer is more the better. The more you can use, the more secure your layers are going to be. The general rule when you are pin basting your quilt top and your batting and backing and everything is that you want your pins to be a fist width apart. So you would want to pin here, 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 and here. But that's not really very helpful when you're trying to figure out how many pins you'll actually need. So I would try to get at least 50, but I'd recommend, if you can find them, get more, get 100, because they do disappear after a while. They get used for other things, or they just get misplaced. So the more the merrier with these guys. The second method is thread basting, and you might actually already have all the tools that you need to thread baste. So first of all, contrasting thread. Pull my quilt back over here. So something that's going to stand out against your quilt top and be easy to see and remove when you need to. You'll also want some hand sewing needles, whatever is comfortable to you to use, and also has an eye big enough to fit your thread comfortably. So pretty simple. And of course, when you're doing any sewing by hand, a thimble is wonderful. And it really saves your fingers and makes the process more enjoyable because you're not getting calluses or sores or whatever. Actually, 2 thimbles might be good. One on this hand to push, and then one on this hand to make sure that you don't poke these fingers. So whichever finger is going to be catching the needle, put a thimble on that one. The third method, the final method I'm going to show you, is glue basting. And all you need is a bottle of washable school glue. In the US, that means Elmer's glue. If you're in another part of the world, I would recommend you find some local quilters and see if they have any good recommendations. And if you would be so kind, would you please leave your own recommendations in the comment section so we can help out future quilters. So there we are. Those are the 3 basting options I'm going to go over in future videos. There are different basting options out there that I'm not going to cover in this series. For instance, basting spray and basting powder, both of which I'm very skeptical about. I think basting spray is very common and very, very popular, but I also know I don't want to breathe all those chemicals and I don't want to baste my quilts outside. One of the last things that you need to consider is the thread that you're going to use for quilting. So this thread color matters because it is going to be sitting on top of your quilt top and you're going to see it. It's going to be very visible. Well, it'll be visible depending on what you choose. So I tend to use cream, white, and gray because I just have a ton of it and I don't want to have a bunch of random colored thread everywhere. So basically what I'm saying is I'm lazy. So I stick with cream, white, and gray most of the time. But that also means that my lines are very visible. If you want your quilting to sort of sink down into your quilt, you can pick a color that will coordinate or match, and it'll blend in a little more and be a little less obvious. You can also try out variegated thread, which I think is fun because it changes color as you go, which can be really great for showing off your quilting if you really like the quilting pattern you've picked out or you want it to be super obvious. Some people, their favorite part of quilting is quilting. That's a funny thing to say. Instead of piecing, they really like the finishing parts. So they really want that step to stand out and shine. So you might choose something that contrasts or has a nice tonal variegation going on. It's really, again, it's up to you and your preference on this. There's no right or wrong. One other thing I want to mention is that I was always told that you wanted 100% cotton thread if you're using a cotton fabric. You're not supposed to mix cotton with polyester thread because this is again just what I was told, cotton ages faster than polyester does. And so eventually your polyester thread is going to be ripping through your cotton fabric like cheese. That's the exact example I was given. But recently I did a video trying to find a good thread that'll blend in really reliably, and people kept recommending polyester thread. So I was very surprised by that. Maybe that isn't the case anymore and you can mix, but I have gotten into the habit of only using cotton. Okay, I'm almost done, I promise. I just want to mention a couple optional tools. We have a guide bar. If you don't want to mark your quilt extensively, you can use a guide bar. And then, of course, there is the walking foot. I mentioned both of these in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about them. But they are both really great to have when you're quilting. And the last thing I want to mention is if you're having a hard time figuring out a quilting pattern, if you want to do something besides straight lines or a grid or whatever, I'm going to leave some links in the description of this video for some quilting books that will help you get inspired and maybe try out a few interesting new ideas. Thanks for spending time with me today, quilters. If you want to support this channel and help me buy supplies and materials for future videos, please visit my Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye!